Hello and welcome back everybody to the Scottish Independence Podcasts. This week's episode we're calling A National Conversation for Scotland.
It's another look at a conversation that Fiona and I had with Leanne Wood. Leanne Wood was a leader of Plaid Cymru for some years. Of course, she was a member of the Senate. She was involved in the Welsh Constitutional Commission. So we got in touch with her and managed to have a conversation about that. We put it out as a podcast, and the timing was just a bit awkward because it was overtaken by all the election coverage. And I have to say also it was rather overtaken by the election result in Scotland. However you describe that election result, if you're an independent supporter, it wasn't a good one. So we thought we'd come back and have another go at bringing you what's in this conversation with Leanne, because it's really, really good listening to her, getting her experience of what it was like trying to build ways of having a conversation with the people of Wales about their constitution and is their current settlement fit for purpose or not. So that's what Leanne's going to be talking about. We're going to be chatting a little bit in between each section.
As a result of the changes or the result of the election, as you were pointing out earlier, the question of a constitutional convention of some kind of comes up because it almost feels as if the political parties have had a go and have failed. They've not managed to make the headway they needed to make. Therefore, it's over to the grassroots, or it's over to people now to decide what kind of country we want. And I think this is where the whole idea of a national conversation is a very different thing to political debate and policy work. This is a much more emotional thing, actually, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's about the kind of country we want to live in.
Yeah, that's true. That's very true. And that's a good thing. There was a whole question that Leanne kind of, tuned in on about just how well informed or not are people about the way that their country is run. And if you're watching this podcast, you're probably a bit like me and Fiona, and probably pretty well informed at least about how Scotland's run. But there was a question there about maybe we assume that people know more than they actually know, which is not to say they're not interested in it, but maybe they don't know that much about how their country was run. And that was one of the things that they realised.
The first topic is how the Welsh Constitutional Convention created a healthy debate.
I think it should provide the sort of food or the nourishment for a much healthier debate about independence for us in Wales going forward, because we haven't really had much to base our debate on. We obviously what's going on in Scotland has been fantastic to watch, especially in the run up to the independence referendum. But we've not really got our own body of literature or academic reports like this one that can help us have that debate. So it's great that we've got the report, and it's also good that you're willing to give us a platform for it. So thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Thank you. Could you maybe just give us a bit of background to it, like where did the idea come from, and what were its aims, just so that people know a bit more about that?
Well, it came about as a result of the cooperation agreement between Plaid Cymru and the Labour government in Wales. There was a cooperation agreement after the 2021 election. There was something like 40 different commitments that the two parties had agreed together, one of which was a commission to look at the future constitutional options in Cymru, Wales. And there had been a commitment in Labour's manifesto to have some sort of body, a commission, to look at everything. But the commitment was strengthened by the cooperation agreement with Plaid Cymru, because it then was going to look at the question of independence. And this was the first time that any sort of official government commission had looked at the question of independence. So we were to take evidence on the range of options, constitutional options for our future that may be available. one being federalism, which was something the Liberal Democrats in particular wanted to explore, and independence was another. And so that was the starting point for the Commission. And I think it was interesting that the chairs who were appointed, it was a co-chaired commission, and it was a gender-balanced co-chairing, and it was Rowan Williams and Laura McAllister, who both come from different political as well as social political traditions in Wales. And Laura has been somebody who's been prepared to push the boundaries on constitutional matters. And Rowan, through his work, I think, in the church and through various sort of charitable organisations, particularly around poverty, had come to the conclusion that the current settlement was not delivering for people in Wales. So the fact that they were together as co-chairs, they brought different things to the table, but they worked very well together. And they both adopted a culture of inclusion and cooperation, which again was something different because previous commissions had been, you know, there had been political sort of dynamics there that weren't necessarily conducive to arriving at good conclusions then, let's put it that way. Yeah. So the culture of the Commission was remarkable how there was a real genuine attempt, I think, to speak to as many people throughout Wales as we possibly could. And I think there were over 10,000 people who engaged with the Commission at some point over the course of the 2 years. Yeah, and we could have spoken to more. We could have done so much more in terms of that public engagement, but it was a genuine attempt to have a national conversation, and various different methods were used in order to do that. There were citizens panels, there were online surveys, there were public meetings, there were art projects which enabled people to express themselves through the medium of murals. There were all kinds of different innovative ways of trying to get people talking about what it is they wanted to have as their constitutional future. And of course, people tend not to talk about the Constitution in constitutional terms. It's all about the bread and butter issues, isn't it? How will these powers affect my life? Who is making the decision? How can I influence that decision? So, you know, it enabled us to open up and explore the debate about the kind of Wales we want to live in. And yeah, so it was a really interesting experience. It was a humbling experience because you could see people going along a journey, and they, you know, many people started telling us they didn't understand the constitutional settlement, they didn't understand where decisions were taken. But of course, some of these processes provided information and took people along a learning journey. And the positions they started out with in some of these citizens panels ended up being different to the positions that they ended up with. So the more information that people had, the more actually, in many cases, they were going along the journey of independence, which I found very, very interesting.
I just love the range of different ways that they found to engage people. And when you think of the numbers involved, you know, 9,500, 10,000 people, obviously you're going to need a lot of different ways to pull those people in. And at one point, Leanne had said that they particularly tried to get communities that are actually hard to reach, who normally they wouldn't engage with. So you can imagine the sort of journey these people are on when they're being exposed to some of these ideas, perhaps for the first time, but in a way they're comfortable responding with. My favourite was the mural. I thought, how fabulous to have murals discussing your country's future. Let's hope that's one that we pick up going forward.
Yes, and indeed. And I mean, I just liked it when she sort of said that, you know, people discovered that they'd heard about this and they got involved in some way or another, or they probably did the quiz. If it was me, I would have done the quiz. But then found out that they'd kind of, without realising it, set out on a constitutional journey because they were learning things about how Wales is run and kind of things at work. And actually, I think it's probably a good, just to emphasise again, that commission included independence as a possible future option for Wales. I mean, that's quite something, actually. I mean, you know, if you go back to the 1970s when Scotland, when we had our constitutional convention, which was at the time about finding out what people thought about having a devolved parliament, but it was decided, I don't know by whom, but it was decided that it would not talk about independence.
Next, a democratic revolution. In 2014, our experience of going through that just exploded people's political awareness and consciousness. But isn't it funny, just the act of talking about it engages people, and then they almost make the decision themselves that, oh, well, maybe that's the best thing after.
Definitely the best way for people to arrive at a different conclusion as well, isn't it? That they arrive at that conclusion themselves after being informed. Because people are making uninformed decisions. People are being asked to make choices without information all the time. And Brexit is a classic example of that, isn't it? But when we provide information, and in Wales, one of the other things we found in the report, you know, there isn't any systematic political education in this country. In Scotland, there are programmes in schools, and have been for many, many years, as I understand it, that teach people about the basics of where powers lie between Holyrood and Westminster, who the key political figures are, and so on. We have had nothing like that in Wales. Now, there are changes to the curriculum on the way, which will enable more of that kind of discussion. But there really, really is a need for enabling people to understand more about how our politics works, because there is a big disconnect between politicians and people. And part of that is that people feel that they can't have any sort of influence or any kind of say in political decision making. And that's especially the case, I think, when it comes to Westminster political decision making, because that's even further away from them. But even in Wales, you know, we've got a Senedd in Cardiff Bay. I live in the valleys 20 miles north of Cardiff Bay, and people feel disconnected from the Senedd, even though actually we're quite close. Well, imagine how disconnected you feel if you live in the north of the country, which is a 5-hour train journey or car journey away, because our transport links are so poor. You know, there are all these kinds of questions. There are wealth divides between communities. There are lots and lots of reasons why people feel disconnected from politics and politicians. And for me, when I came to Scotland on numerous occasions in 2014 and felt the excitement and, well, it was nothing short of a democratic revolution in people's minds, really. You know, there was something there that gave me some hope that we could do something in Wales that was similar, that we could have our own democratic revolution. And maybe one day we will, and maybe it'll be after you in Scotland, maybe it'll be before.
That's right, you never know. But you're right. I mean, thinking back to that campaign, you know, in the run-up to the referendum 2014, I live in Glasgow, and, you know, I mean, in Glasgow anyway, you know, if you go on a bus, people think it's a bit strange if you don't talk to the complete stranger sitting next to you. But it was even more so in that run-up. You get on the bus and, you know, say hello and chat. And then either I would say, or the person would say, so have you decided which way you're going to vote yet? And then there was all these little chats going on buses and taxis and trains about what people thought about it. It was just brilliant. And some of the groups that came out of that, there was one in particular called, what's it called, Fiona? Radical Independence Campaign. That's right. And they went into the housing schemes, particularly around the bigger cities. And their one aim, I mean, they obviously wanted people to vote yes, but really what they did was they made sure that people were on the voters' roll, because a lot of people weren't. That was just amazing, seeing all that happening. It was great.
Well, I saw it myself, Marlene, and I was blown away. I went to a number of some of the big tower blocks in Glasgow, and I came back a number of times. I had conversations with taxi drivers. I had conversations with waiters and waitresses in cafes. I remember seeing one really, really coffee-stained copy of the big booklet that was produced by the Scottish Government outlining all the answers to all the questions. I mean, it was obviously people were looking at it and they were discussing things, and that's why I see it as a democratic revolution, really. I mean, everybody, it seemed to me, was engaged. There was nobody who was neutral. Everybody had a view. Wherever you went, people were talking about it. And the excitement was palpable as well, because people could really envision a very different future to the one we were all heading in, and the one we've headed in since, really. You know, everything seemed possible that summer.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. I mean, what mainly came out of that was a couple of things, but it's the act of engaging with people that's the best way to get people, to help people make decisions. Get them engaged, give them good information. That's the basis in which to make sure that good decisions are made. She was very clear on that, I thought. And, you know, she did sort of say that Scotland's much better about teaching young people about, you know, the set-up for Scotland and how it's governed and ins and out, and compared to Wales. I mean, I did have a wee question about that, but whether, you know, teaching in Scotland about the education, how much better is it really? You know, possibly it is in terms of how Holyrood works and how the election works. And I suppose when you think about it, we've got 16 and 17-year-olds voting. You'd hope that they do get a decent grounding in how that voting system works. So
I wonder if that is something that perhaps has come more to the fore since the referendum, that has raised everybody's engagement. Because I asked my son, he would have been 21 in the referendum. I asked him what he got at school by way of constitution. He couldn't remember anything. Now, that might just have been him. Doesn't mean it didn't happen, but he certainly had no recollection of it. So it might be just that it's something we're more switched on to. And, you know, I was just thinking the other day, next month is 10 years since our referendum. If you were 15 3/4, you're now nearly 26, and you haven't had a chance to say anything about your country's future. A generation, in fact.
Yes, well, yes. I mean, pity we had to wait that long, but I kind of had a bit of a, just remember how it was. And I mean, it's not that you'd think it would still be like that 10 years on, and it won't be. If we do manage to recreate, you know, enthusiasm and, you know, a bit of determination for, well, it'll have to be the run up to the 2026 Holyrood election. It's not going to be the same as it was then, but wouldn't it be great if it somehow was akin to that again? That was fantastic.
I can get more excited about the idea if I'm thinking it is more a national conversation with some actual cultural element to it and people talking to people rather than politicians slugging it out. I mean, we know what the tone of discourse is like at Westminster, but it has been creeping that way in Holyrood as well. And we've both remarked on it in podcasts, particularly from the Tories, but also, you know, from the others. What response did the Welsh Constitutional Convention get from Westminster? Leanne gives us her expectations. Interesting to see how that does work out in practice now that there is a Labour government at Westminster and a Labour government in Wales. Leanne wasn't terribly confident that it would make a difference, but let's see what she says.
The silence from Westminster has been deafening. We had hoped, and we continue to hope, I think, all of us who are members of the Commission, that the recommendations will be picked up by the various political parties and included in manifestos. There are a number of recommendations designed to strengthen democracy, to strengthen relations between Westminster and Cardiff, or not so much strengthen relations, but recognise that Wales exists and provide us with some respect in that intergovernmental relationship. And then there are recommendations around which powers should be devolved immediately in order to ensure that the settlement is fit for purpose, because one of the conclusions we drew as a commission was that the settlement is not fit for purpose, is not working, and the status quo cannot continue. There are risks for Wales from the status quo continuing in its present form. So there are a number of recommendations around devolving the criminal justice system, around broadcasting, energy. We've looked at other non-devolved matters. And then, of course, there are issues that we didn't have time to look at. So we weren't able to look at in any great detail or depth the position of the Welsh economy vis-à-vis Westminster and the rest of the UK, or big questions like immigration, for example. So there is still a huge amount of work that can continue to be done after the publication of this report. So recommendations implemented in the manifestos, continue to think about what else needs to be devolved in and the other sort of policy areas that we weren't able to cover in the report. Certainly setting up some institutional bodies to take seriously this question of democratic understanding, so that we have some means of enabling people to become more informed about their political settlement circumstances, how they can influence things. One of the recommendations as well is to set up a constitutional conversation. What I would like to see develop into is something along the lines of, I was very inspired by what had happened in Iceland when they crowdsourced their constitution. They put a citizens' body together to learn about and build and create and consult on a national constitution for Iceland. And I just love the idea of citizens being involved in their constitution building in that way. And it may be that we couldn't create a Welsh constitution because we're not an independent country, but we could practice for the time when we become an independent country, and we can then carry out that kind of exercise with citizens building their constitution. And in the meantime, we can carry out an exercise whereby people input into what the constitutional principles could be, or we could have a debate anyway about our constitution.
I sort of like that idea of practicing for it for when we're independent, and practicing for a constitution. We quite like that, didn't we?
Yes, we did.
We quite like that. And I mean, I don't know too much about what happened in Iceland, but I've heard Leslie Riddoch talking about it when they were revamping their constitution. I mean, I suppose it just got me thinking about, there are various efforts and groups of people getting together at the moment to, just try different approaches to that. There's a constitution for Scotland, people. I mean, that's an actual constitution that a group of people have written, and then it's now there as a wiki. You can go in and make comments. And I went to a few Zoom meetings with them talking about it. It's a shame, but they haven't attracted a lot of people into looking at the details of that. It's actually quite a hard thing to do, and maybe that's not surprising. There aren't too many kind of geeks who'll go and do it. So that's the Constitution for Scotland group. And as you know, I was involved as a Pensioner for Indy representative with a group that Mike Russell put together when he was president of the SNP. He got about a dozen yes groups together to look through and make suggestions about an interim constitution. Now, we weren't writing the constitution, but Elliot Bulmer wrote it. We then went through it with a very, very fine tooth comb. But again, that's kind of, it's not sunk completely, but it's sunk from view. It could come up the surface again. It could be regenerated. And then there was the idea of the SNP came up themselves that, to create a constitutional convention. But that was going to be on the basis of having a majority of seats in Westminster. So that's kind of slid out of focus, at least for the moment.
So in a way, the fact that the SNP-driven constitutional convention has paused, let's say, stalled, perhaps, it doesn't mean that's it over. And we know we saw a lot in the papers about, well, that's it, independence instead. I don't think so. Having moved from that forum under an SNP heading, which is actually, maybe it's an advantage for it now to be in a much more people version. And as we know, Believe in Scotland are non-party political, and they are starting up an initiative, which I'll just pull up so we can see the title, the Scottish Citizens Convention, Creating a Better Scotland. And we'll come on to that next week, actually, where we're going to be interviewing Gordon McIntyre-Kemp to get him to tell us a lot more about what's sitting behind that. But then the other group that've got something on the go is the Scottish Independence Forum, who are also looking at some kind of civic convention. Now, I suppose the question that comes up in my mind is, why have we got two separate things? Could they maybe merge at some point? Maybe that's something we can ask Gordon when we speak to him. So definitely stuff is happening on the Constitutional Convention.
Yeah, and that Independence Forum Scotland, if you have a look on their website, you can and look under National Convention. They had a preliminary meeting back in February just to kind of talk through, what their aims and their purposes would be, and how they might take it forward. They came up with a range of what they've identified as key topics for a first meeting of the actual convention. But then it's complicated, isn't it? Because you've also got to think practicalities of setting up a convention, membership, a kind of, I don't know what you call it, secretariat to run it, money. These things cost money. Have a look on the website. It's a start, but it's quite an impressive start. And they've also got a YouTube video about it you can go and have a look at as well.
I mean, the other thing that strikes me about those two, they're both being driven by independence organisations. And the difference with the Welsh setup was that it was independent of government, independent of party politics, and they actually had commissioners appointed. And I'm not sure about the Independence Forum proposal, but certainly in the Believe in Scotland proposal, the suggestion is that it would be run by trustees, would be appointed. So it wouldn't be something that's run by the independence movement, although we would be campaigning alongside it, but it would be a genuinely open forum so that civic organisations who wouldn't support something to discuss independence per se would discuss what about Scotland's future, which seems to me to be the right way to go.
If you can do it, set something up in the way that allows people who are not pro-independence to feel, oh, I could go there and express what I think would be the best way forward. That's ideally what we want. Otherwise, you just end up with, you might end up with something that's very good if you're an independent supporter, but, isn't broad enough to actually kind of go anywhere with. And although it's true that the Welsh Commission was independent of the Welsh government, it was funded by the Welsh government.
Yes, indeed it was. And the Welsh government approved the 3 scenarios that they were to look at, whereas ours, we don't even have to have a predetermined 3 scenarios, depending how it's set up. But I think the important thing is that it's not set up in order to only produce one scenario, because then it loses any legitimacy from people who aren't independent supporting.
Exactly. Exactly.
So fine line to walk, really.
It is a fine line. It is a fine line to walk. How do you bring non-indie supporting people into the conversation? Those are things they're not problems, but they have to be tackled if you want to have a national conversation. Otherwise, it's not a national conversation. It's a 50% of the population conversation. Let's head on to the last 2 sections of our chat with Leanne. So the first one is called The Crux of the Report, and then the last section is called A Voice for the People.
The next government in Westminster is going to be Labour, although I'm not sure how different that is going to turn out to be to the current Tories. There doesn't seem to be that much space between them. Do you think that a Labour government there is going to make a difference in how seriously they take the output of your commission? Because, this sort of tin ear that we get from the Tories in Westminster, that applies to anything we try to put to them as well. They just ignore it if they can't actually scupper it. But are you expecting to get a more open reception?
Labour's first reaction to the report was quite negative, really. Their Shadow Secretary of State for Wales kind of dismissed the basic calls around the devolution of the criminal justice system that we said in the report have to happen immediately in order to ensure that our constitutional settlement remains viable. So that didn't bode well. And of course, Labour has always been a coalition of people who stand on different places on the line between British nationalism and independence, to put it that way. So given all of that, I'm not massively hopeful that this is going to be a huge priority area for them. They've had the Gordon Brown report, and it'll be interesting to see how much of that is implemented. But again, I mean, that's very weak, really.
That's kind of sunk without trace in terms of discussion, hasn't it?
Yeah. So nobody's been talking about that really either. In some ways, this is the question that comes to the crux of our report, really. It's, there were many people giving evidence to us about the poverty levels in Wales and the difficulties that people are facing as a result of poverty, and the difficulties the government faces in terms of tackling those problems, not just from a benefits perspective, but from an economic perspective. It doesn't have the powers to change the economic circumstances, which would enable people to pay more taxes into the pot, which would then enable more public services to be provided, and so on. And it's one of these sort of dilemmas, we don't have the powers, we can't fix the economy. Westminster isn't interested in fixing our economy, but it also isn't interested in giving us the economic powers that we could use to change our future. So we're in this perpetual poverty trap where we can't affect our future economically at all. And that was, it was the big thing that was kind of backdrop in the report, but it was the thing that we couldn't really go into in any depth either, because once you start opening the whole economic basket of questions, that's another 2 or 3 years worth of work. I think, and we just didn't have time to cover everything that we needed to. So we didn't look really at any depth at those wider economic questions.
Yeah, we've got limited power up here to tweak the income tax rates, and when that was given, there was I heard quite a few people saying, of course the Tories or Westminster are doing that because it's a bit of a trap. Yes, you can raise income tax, but then you've raised income tax and people won't like that, so then they'll stop voting for it. And at the time I thought, well, the English Tories or even the English Labour may think that that's a trap, but actually I was pretty certain that people up here would go, well, yeah, if I'm earning 100,000 a year, of course I don't mind paying a bit more if that will help inequalities and start to kind of do something about that. Because that kind of approach is it's pretty well part and parcel of how we think about what we should do for each other. But that has given the Scottish Government a bit of leeway. I'm sure that's partly, it's not a huge pot of money that it produces, but I'm sure it's partly where they can get the money for that £25 a week. And sometimes I think actually the Scottish Government or SNP themselves are not good enough at blowing their own trumpet, because that's pretty impressive when you can set something like that up.
Definitely, it's very impressive indeed, and because you've got those tax powers and the flexibility within those tax powers to set the bands in the way that they've been set, has enabled you to be much more successful at raising money to be able to then spend on those social programs. I mean, in Wales, we're stuck with 3 bands, and the highest rate of taxpayers are very, very small in number. So there is much more limited room for manoeuvre. That said, though, I mean, taxes could be raised to pay for public services. The Labour government hasn't been as bold to do that as yet. So we'll keep an eye on the situation. But yeah, I mean, there's certainly, as we experience more austerity that is on the way, I think this is something they are probably going to have to look at in the future.
In coming up with that commission, you've managed to create something that was independent from government, which seems to give it more credibility, I think, and clearly 2 years worth of really extensive reaching out to groups that normally wouldn't have a voice, I think, in quite imaginative ways, but the way you've described it. I kind of wonder if we could do that at this stage, take that 2 years and invest in that, rather than, all our efforts seem to be going into a constitutional convention, which is a talking shop, essentially, ideally with civic society rather than just politicians. But I don't know that is, I suppose it depends how you set it up.
Yeah.
But I'm just really quite attracted to the idea of an actual commission. And if we set it up now, we'd have a report by 2026, which is when the Holyrood elections are.
Could you combine the two and turn a constitutional convention into a report like the one that we've produced?
I think we could.
Again, another two very thought-provoking sections. The one thing that immediately leaps to my mind when you're talking about, a discussion with the people is, I suppose Wales had this problem as well. Maybe it'd be interesting to find out how they sorted it. But our media is overwhelmingly anti-independence. Some would say anti-Scottish in some respects as well. And, any conversation that we're going to have is going to be against a backdrop of an onslaught of, ridicule, criticism, challenging, probably a lot more so than was the case in 2014, I would think. Now, how we managed to have a genuinely open conversation against that kind of backdrop is going to be something that is going to have to be thrashed out. I don't know how we would manage to do it.
Yeah, it's certainly something that needs to be tackled. I mean, one of the things that came, I know you thought of this as well, was just going through the recording with Leanne and, refamiliarising myself with it again. And I was just sort of brought to mind that there are current moves around the UK that might result in the breakup of the UK. Now, they're not happening in England, but there's a Welsh Commission report. It may be in abeyance for the moment, but it's happened, and they have recommendations to take ahead for the Welsh government. In the general election, Sinn Féin are now the party with the largest number of MPs in Westminster. Not that they send their MPs to Westminster, but they do have the largest number. And you commented that shortly after that election, the Irish government, they're talking about initiating, some sort of consultation on having a reunification or a border referendum.
Just last night, I saw a tweet saying that they would challenge, if necessary, through the international courts, their right to have a referendum, because, of course, that right is enshrined in the Good Friday Agreement, which is an international treaty.
Yes.
So that could get very interesting.
That could get very, very interesting. I mean, in some ways, my less optimistic moments when I think, oh God, we'll never manage to get some sort of definitive statement and result about Scotland wanting to be independent, given all the opposition from Westminster. But actually, sometimes I think maybe what Scotland needs is for Ireland, for Northern Ireland and Éire to reunite and to go through that process, because that would make it much easier, I think, for something to get set up in Scotland. And I mean, actually, I'm a fan of the Newscast podcast, and often Laura Kuenssberg is on it. And I was watching it. Well, it was the day after the general election, and she was making a comment about, and Sinn Féin are now the largest party in terms of Northern Ireland MPs. Of course, they're also the largest party in terms of Stormont now. I don't know if they're the largest party in terms of Northern Ireland local elections, but they have a lot of representatives there. They probably are or close to it. And then Laura Kuenssberg just said, well, when you get to that stage, obviously that means that there'll have to be some sort of discussion about a border referendum, because when Sinn Féin have that kind of mandate, then it all means it's that much further forward. And I'm going, oh yeah, Laura, what about Scotland when we had, how many dozen?
56 out of 58. Yeah.
However, if you watch these podcasts, folks, you know that despite that my disagreements with Laura Kuenssberg, I still carry on watching the Newscast podcast. So that's the end of this podcast, nearly. But we've got another good one coming up along the same theme.
Well, yes, just to round off, things have moved on. Sometimes you don't know what's around the corner. When we had our discussion with Leanne, it was only a few weeks ago. And at that point, we didn't know there was going to be a general election, never mind what the outcome was going to be. But the outcome has changed things. So it is worth looking at what options we now have. So moving towards a national conversation along the Welsh lines, but set up by grassroots, does seem to be, I think, quite a strong option. That's Believe in Scotland's proposal. And we will go into that in much more detail next week when we have Gordon McIntyre Kemp as our guest. We've touched on the Independence for Scotland Forum. We'll put the link in the notes for their website if you want to have a look at it. Also, the Believe in Scotland one. We'll also put the link to our previous conversation with Leanne, just in case you want to refresh yourself. That was probably a longer look at some of the recommendations from the Welsh report. They're probably less relevant to us right now. Join us again next week and let's see where we go. I mean, it could be a very exciting 2 years ahead of us.
Yep. And thanks for watching and listening.
And if you have any questions on the citizens' conversation that you'd like us to raise with Gordon McIntyre Kemp, drop us an email at indiepodcasters@gmail.com and we'll try and get those into the conversation for you. Thanks again for listening. Bye now.